So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be learning with you again here as part of Drisha's Springsman. This is our 25th annual Rapoport Family Memorial Lecture, the Seder Ritual and the Foundation of Community with Rabbi David Silber, sponsored by the Rapoport family. Just before we start, some technical information. As you join the Zoom, I will invite you to become a panelist. It just means that you can turn on your camera so we can see your lovely smiling faces if you wish, and you'll be able to unmute yourself if there's an opportunity for questions and comments. We encourage you to accept that invitation. When you're not speaking, we ask that you stay on mute. It just minimizes the background noise so that we can all hear each other. But your questions and comments are always welcome in the Facebook chat. And with that, I will pass over to Samuel Rapoport to give the introduction.
Good afternoon. My name is Sam Rapoport. On behalf of my wife, Sandra, and our family, welcome to the 25th Annual Rapoport Family Memorial Lecture at Drisha. 26 years ago, following the recent death of my father, Pesach David ben Yaakov Yitzhak HaKohen, Zichrono Lebracha, at Sandra's suggestion, we approached Rabbi David Silber, the founder and dean of Drisha Institute of Jewish Education. Considering my father's name, Pesach David, Rabbi Silber suggested we memorialize him with an annual Pesach-themed lecture. This annual lecture now memorializes both of Sandra's parents, Gabriel Sharon and Rebecca Meneget Sharon, as well as both of my parents, Rosa and David Rapoport. Our beloved teacher and advisor, Rabbi David Silber, with whom we have been learning weekly for over 3 decades, delivered the first Rapoport Family Memorial Lecture in 1999. In the ensuing 25 years, through Rabbi Silber's wisdom and labor, the Drisha Institute for Jewish Education has grown and enormously expanded its frontiers and influence. And this lecture has become an anticipated fixture of pre-Pesach community learning, nowadays reaching even further through Zoom. Rabbi Silber honors us again today by delivering the 25th Rapoport Family Memorial Lecture. It is entitled The Seder Ritual and the Formation of Community. Thank you all for participating in this event to honor the memory of Sandra and my parents and to learn together with Rabbi David Silber. Wishing everyone a Pesach that celebrates our historical redemption from Egypt, as well as, with God's help, Israel's present-day victory and redemption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure and honor to be giving the 25th Rapoport Family Memorial Lecture. It's hard to believe it's 25 years, but in any event, okay, so as Dr. Rapoport mentioned, typically the lecture is before Pesach and has something to do with Pesach. And this year is certainly no exception. So I want to jump in right away and discuss elements of the Seder and what it means to be a Jewish community. Let me begin with the statement that we find in the Haggadah, that b'chol dar v'dar chayav adam urot et atzmo ki'u hu yatsa miMitzrayim. And in every generation, one should see oneself as if he or she personally left Egypt. The context of that statement is found in the Haggadah in the context towards the end of the section in which we tell the story, called Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the telling of the story. Towards the very end of that section, before we eat the meal, we are about to recite the beginnings of the Hallel. The Hallel consists of 6 psalms that are recited on festivals, and at the Seder, of course, it's interesting that it's broken up into 2 parts. We start reciting the Hallel before the meal, and we complete the Hallel after the meal. But before we recite the Hallel, we say that in every generation, we see ourselves personally as leaving Egypt. And this is the introduction to the Hallel. It says, not only did our God save our ancestors, we were also saved. That's where we find this statement before the recitation of the prayer of thanksgiving, the Hallel. It's actually very interesting that the Haggadah is by far and away the most popular Jewish book and the most significant Jewish ritual that we have. And there are many questions that have been raised over the course of hundreds of years about the Haggadah. And here's a very interesting question I came across in terms of the Seder. The question that is asked by many of the medieval commentaries is, how come at the Seder we don't make the blessing, "Blessed are you, O Lord, she'asa nisim l'avotenu bayomim hahem bazman hazeh." God will perform miracles for our ancestors at this time. We make this blessing on Purim when we read the Megillah. We make the blessing when we light the Hanukkah candles. The miracle of Hanukkah, the miracle of Purim. There's no greater miracle in our tradition, the central miracle. And the central event is the Exodus from Egypt. It's one miracle after the next. It's the 10 plagues, it's the crossing of the sea, etc. How come there's no blessing of she'asa nisim l'avotenu? So the answer that's given in some of the medieval works, the Shibbolei HaLeket, the Manig, and many others, the Abudraham, they pretty much all say the same thing, which is that we don't make the blessing she'asa nisim l'avotenu, because later in the Haggadah, it's going to say, not only did God redeem our ancestors, but God redeemed us as well. I just want to sharpen what they say, and probably this is their intention. And that is, it's not just that we say in the Haggadah that God saved not only our ancestors, but saved ourselves. But at the end of this section of telling the story, there is a blessing. We take a cup of wine, the second cup of wine, and we make the blessing, "Blessed are you, O God, asher ga'alanu v'ga'alat avotenu miMitzrayim," who saved us and our ancestors from Egypt. The blessing ends with the words, "Baruch atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael," the Redeemer of Israel. In other words, the very blessing itself that we are saying at the end on the second cup, at the end of the section where we tell the story and begin to recite the Hallel, we say explicitly, it's a bracha. "Blessed are you, O God, who saved us and has saved our ancestors." And I would add to this that it's not just that blessing substitutes for she'asa nisim l'avotenu, but it's actually different. Because the blessing of she'asa nisim l'avotenu that we say when we read the Megillah or light the Hanukkah candles speaks of, you did a miracle for our ancestors at this time. But the blessing at the Seder is different. The blessing at the Seder is you did a miracle for the ancestors and for us at this time. It's different. It goes way beyond just commemorating the day that our ancestors were delivered. We're claiming that in some sense, we ourselves are delivered. We are imagining that we are actually in Mitzrayim. We have to exercise our religious imagination. We're obligated to exercise our religious imagination and think of ourselves as leaving Egypt. And actually, this idea of actually imagining ourselves as there plays out in the Haggadah in a very interesting way. The Haggadah has several key texts at the Seder. And one of the key texts is the prayer that the pilgrim says when the pilgrim brings the first fruits to the temple. In Deuteronomy chapter 26, Arami Oved Avi, my father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt. It talks about our persecution in Egypt and our cries out to God and God's redemption. Those are the four verses that the Haggadah puts at the center of the Haggadah, and we are to expound upon these verses. V'doresh kol ha'parsha kula, Arami Oved Avi. But what's interesting is when you open up the Chumash and you read what it says, it doesn't stop there. The next verse is about you brought us to this land. But at the Seder, we don't mention bringing us to the land. We stop at the Exodus. And the same thing is true about the verses we cite about the promise to Abraham, covenantal promise to Abraham. We stop with the verse, and afterwards they will leave with many possessions. But the promise to Abraham extends beyond that. I'm going to bring them into the land, says God. The fourth generation shall return to the land. We don't mention that in the core text, that we're stopping at the Exodus. as if we're trying to see ourselves at that moment of the Exodus. Because the people who leave Egypt, they have promises, but they're not realized promises. They're anticipated, they're hopes, they're dreams. Imagine being in that place, traveling into the unknown. That's what the Seder calls us to do, to imagine we're at the beginning of nationhood. So that's what I wanted to briefly have this opportunity. The Seder, of course, it says in the Seder that Rabbi Akiva and his comrades were up the entire night studying the Haggadah, studying the Exodus. We have an hour. So in this hour, we're going to try to get to some of the critical points of the Seder. And hopefully, this will be helpful for the various Seders that we have in our homes. When you think about leaving Mitzrayim, we're imagining leaving Mitzrayim. So in the Torah, the critical moment, the critical event, that which must happen before we can leave Egypt is we must bring the Paschal sacrifice. We must bring the Korban Pesach. You can't leave Egypt until you bring the Korban Pesach. And the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice, which actually, yesterday in the synagogues, we read, as we introduced the month of Nisan, the month in which Pesach is celebrated, we read chapter 12. We read about the commandment to take and to bring the Paschal sacrifice. It's interesting that this verse, this discussion of this is the month, the first month, in which you bring the sacrifice, the very first commentary of Rashi says, why did the Torah start with Genesis, says Rashi. The Torah should have started with Exodus chapter 12, because this is the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people. Why discuss Breshit, the time of creation, the 6 days and the 7 days of creation? If you're talking about time, let's get to much more important time, says Rashi, the beginnings of Jewish nationhood, which is the month of Nisan. HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim. So I want just to expand briefly upon this idea of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim. Because when you read the Torah, it sounds like this is the month, and now we're going to tell you what you do in the month. But the rabbinic understanding was different. The rabbinic understanding is that this is the first month. It's not just a statement of fact, but it actually is a commandment. The first commandment to the Jewish people has to do with Kiddush HaChodesh, with sanctifying the month. In other words, the court determines what day is the first day of the month. In Talmudic thinking, the month can begin on one of two different days. The month can be a 29-day month, and the month can be a 30-day month. And the court, based on witnesses who come there, and based on their own calculations, determines what day is the first day of the month. It's called Kiddush HaChodesh, and this is a mitzvah. And not only is it a mitzvah to determine what day the month is, how long the month will be, previous month, but also related to this is another mitzvah, also related to Pesach. Pesach must always fall at a certain time of the year, always must come in the spring. And in order to ensure that, there's another mitzvah of the intercalating of the year. So the month is a solar month, but the month is a lunar month, but the year is a solar year, and the court has the obligation to fix the calendar. Does the year have 12 months, or does the year have 13 months? That's up to the court. In other words, the idea of time, the idea that you, Jewish people, have your own calendar. And not only do you have your own calendar, but you're a partner in determining how the calendar works. That is the first mitzvah. And I was thinking about this. Of course, the Jews are slaves. Slaves don't have their own time. Slaves work on Pharaoh's time. When Moshe says to Paro, we want to serve God by going off to the desert for 3 days and bringing sacrifices to our God, Paro says to them, I can't do that. You want to have it, he says, you want to have a Shabbos? You want to have a Shabbat? Not on my watch. There's no Shabbat on my watch. So your time is not your time. Your time is controlled by somebody else. And the first step towards freedom is to understand you have your own time. You are masters of your own time. You, according to the rabbinic understanding, you can determine your own time to the extent, just to give an example how far you take this. You know, in the summertime, when the days are long, sometimes someone invites you for a meal and you say, what time are you starting Shabbos? It's a very strange question. Maybe what time I'm starting Shabbos. When the three stars come out or when the sun sets or whatever, that's Shabbos. No, we're starting Shabbos early, right? We're starting Shabbos early because the halacha is you can actually add on to Shabbos. You can start Shabbos late Friday. So the idea that you actually have control of time within certain limits, that's a deep rabbinic teaching. And that speaks to one's freedom. So the first step about being a community, a Jewish community in Egypt is you have your own calendar, you mark your own time, you have your own festivals. And not only that, but you can actually sanctify time. And this speaks to the Seder. Because the Seder, what does Seder mean? Seder means an order. The Seder is an ordered event. And the ordering principle of the Seder are the 4 cups of wine. The 4 cups of wine are the way we order the Seder. These are 4 mitzvot, 4 commandments that we fulfill. Telling the story, we say over the 2nd cup of wine. Eating the matzah and the bitter herbs and the maror and the festive meal is the 3rd cup of wine. Hallel is the 4th cup of wine. But what is the 1st cup of wine? How do we begin the Seder? Answer, the 1st cup of wine is Kiddush. Kiddush. Pesach is a holy day. And on holy days, whether it's Shabbat, whether it's Pesach, whether it's Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, we say Kiddush. And the idea of Kiddush is to sanctify the day. It's not just another day. It's a sacred day. And here there's something very interesting about Kiddush at the Seder. First of all, if it were up to me, I would have said, that's not part of the Seder. You say Kiddush all the time. You say Kiddush every Shabbat, every Friday night. What's the relevance to the Seder? But apparently, that's not true. Apparently, Kiddush at the Seder is different from every other Kiddush. And here we come to something very interesting. And I put it out there and invite those interested to really to study this because it's quite an interesting business. Apparently, well over 1,000 years ago, close to 1,500 years ago, there was a different Kiddush for the Seder. There was a different blessing on the wine, and there was an embellished and expanded Kiddush specifically for the Seder. And there was a huge debate among the rabbinic authorities at the time, the Gaonim, as they're known, whether this is valid or not. The first of the Gaonim, Rav Natronai Gaon, was opposed to this. You can't change Kiddush for Pesach. But other Gaonim disagreed and permitted certain changes or certain embellishments of the Kiddush at the Seder. Most famous is Reb Saadia Gaon, the great Reb Saadia Gaon, the 10th century great sage, permitted embellishments of the Kiddush at the Seder, and to this very day, some of the Yemenite community apparently still follows this position of Reb Saadia Gaon. And the reason Kiddush at the Seder is different, it's actually part of the Seder. It's because if the Seder is about being a community, being a free community, what speaks more to freedom than our ability, first of all, to have our own calendar, to declare what days are sacred, are special, time and sacred time. So we begin the Seder with the introduction to the Paschal sacrifice, which is Kiddush. But the Kiddush at the Seder is more than just marking a day or determining the time. It's making a different point. There's something called sacred time. In the book of Exodus, sacred time, Pesach is a sacred day. You don't work on Pesach, and Shabbat. And the book of Exodus actually ends with 2 things, with the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, sacred space, and conjoined with sacred space twice, the book of Exodus, sacred time. That's the first cup at the Seder, and the first, I would say, element of what it means through the Seder and through our tradition to be our own community, to be separate from Mitzrayim. That's the first cup. Now let's come back to the Korban Pesach. You can't leave Egypt until you bring the Paschal sacrifice. That's clear. Only when you bring the Paschal sacrifice can you leave. So what is it about the Paschal sacrifice? What is it about the sacrifice that is absolutely essential? So let me begin with the following observation, and that is that actually the Paschal sacrifice is in a certain sense nothing new. Because if we remember the story of the Exodus, Moshe has been appointed by God to be the representative of the Jewish people and God's representative to Pharaoh. It's not a mission that he accepted with great glee, but at the end of the day, he is the spokesperson for the Jewish people, and he goes to Pharaoh in the 5th chapter of the book of Exodus, and he says, listen, we want to go out to the desert for 3 days to worship our God, to bring sacrifices to our God. And Paro refuses to permit that. On the contrary, he makes life even more difficult. He says, you're busy working. I can't afford to everybody take off all these days, 3-day journey there, 3-day journey back. I'll lose a whole week of time. No, this is not going to work. You're just lazy. And he imposes more hardships upon the Jews. He takes away their straw. They have to forage for straw. They have to produce the same number of bricks. So that request to serve God together as a community, and Pharaoh during the plague says, okay, maybe you can take the men, not the women. No. The men, the women, the old, the young, even have possessions. Everybody has to go. And Pharaoh refuses. What was Moshe's thinking over here? Why is it important? I don't believe he intends to run away. I don't think so. I think he intends to return. Because at one point, Pharaoh says, I'll let you go, but don't go too far. So you can't run away. And Moshe said, that's fine. Because the intent is not to run away. But the understanding is before we can leave Egypt, we have to be the beginnings of nation that have to be there. And the definition of nation, it is the people that serve God together. All of us, men, women, children, everybody, we have to be together. But that doesn't happen. But it does happen. Because what happens after the 9th plague is that the Egyptian people begin to favor Moshe and favor the Jews. And they recognize that maybe God is on their side. And they've been suffering by opposing the Jews. So now it's possible to bring that very sacrifice that they thought they could not bring in Egypt. The Egyptians would never permit it. But it becomes possible now to bring the Korban Pesach. That sacrifice itself, which formerly was requested to be brought in the desert, can now be brought in the land of Egypt. And only once you bring the Korban Pesach can you leave. Because to leave is a bunch of slaves, one unrelated to the next. That's not going to work. Because it's about becoming a people. It's about peoplehood. It's about understanding community. And the Korban Pesach is central towards an understanding of community. Now the question is, what is it about the Korban Pesach that is so essential? Now, when you read the Torah, actually, what it sounds like is that on the night of the 15th, at the Seder, we call it the Seder, basically the emphasis in the Torah is that's when you eat the Paschal sacrifice. The Paschal sacrifice was brought on the 14th, on the day of the 14th, and but it's eaten at night. You eat at night with the matzah, with the maror. That's what the Torah says. Then you can leave. But that's what has to happen in Egypt and beyond. The rabbinic understanding, though, was it's not just about eating the Paschal sacrifice. That is, of course, central to the Seder, the meal. But there's something else as well. It's interwoven with telling the story. So the telling of the story and the meal together are the Seder. And if you think about the Seder that we have, we start with Kiddush. The first cup is Kiddush. What is Kiddush? Kiddush is the beginning of the meal. The festive meal begins with the Kiddush. Shabbat, the Chagim, it's the beginning of the meal. In fact, the halacha is Kiddush b'makom suda. The halacha is that to fulfill the Kiddush, You can only fulfill the Kiddush if you make Kiddush in the place where you eat. That's the rule called Kiddush b'makom suda. That's how the meal starts. And one would expect in the great festive meal, the holiday of our freedom, that right after Kiddush, you'd wash your hands and you'd eat the meal. Well, we actually do wash our hands, but we don't eat. We put the food aside and we begin to tell the story. So the Seder is you start the meal, then you tell the story, then you start saying Hallel, but you don't finish Hallel. You start only the first two Psalms, and then you stop, you wash again, and then you eat the meal. Only after the meal do you finish the Hallel. So the Seder consists of what we eat, the festive meal, and what we say, telling the story and the Psalms of gratitude. The interweaving of the two is what we call the Seder. That's the construction of the Seder. Now I want to focus our attention on the second cup. The first cup is Kiddush, control of time and sanctified time. But we have our own calendar. And now we come to the Korban Pesach. And now we come to the second cup. So what is unique about the Paschal sacrifice? And then we'll discuss what we do with the Seder. The Paschal sacrifice is an unusual sacrifice. It's actually very interesting that if you open up the book of Vayikra, the third book of the Torah, which talks about all the sacrifices, one of the striking features is that the Korban Pesach is not there. Korban Pesach is actually not mentioned in the whole book of Vayikra. It's rather remarkable. But it's mentioned most prominently as part of the Exodus story. Now, we know in terms of sacrifices, there are two kinds of sacrifices. There are communal sacrifices, Korban Sibor, and there are individual private sacrifices. Anybody can offer a sacrifice in the temple, all different kinds of sacrifices. What is the Korban Pesach? What is the Paschal sacrifice? Is it a communal sacrifice or is it a personal private sacrifice? So I think if you think about it, it's rather interesting. From a technical standpoint, it's actually not a communal sacrifice. It's not one sacrifice that's brought for the entire community, like the daily sacrifices, like the Korban Tamid, the two daily offerings, or the Musaf, the special sacrifices of Shabbat and the festivals. It's brought by a family. It's brought by, in the words of the Torah, a bayit, a house. But, and this is the but it's brought by every house. The key word in the Korban Pesach is the word bayit. It's brought by the bayit, which means the members of the house. Those who bring the Korban Pesach, says the Torah, may not leave the house. Al yetzu ish bipetach beito, you can't leave the house. And on top of that, it's brought on the house. Sacrifices are normally brought on some kind of altar. The Korban Pesach, the blood is smeared on the doorpost and on the lintel of the house. So it's by the house, in the house, and on the house. And we are all reminded of how the book of Exodus begins. They came down to Egypt together with Jacob, ish ubeito ba'u. They came down, each one with their house. And because of the slavery and because of the persecution, we lost the sense of what it means to be a larger community. We lost the sense of family. We lost the sense of peoplehood. We never had the sense of peoplehood. And the Korban Pesach then is the first step towards becoming a people. It's the transitional moment from family to nation. It's brought by the bayit, and the Torah says you have to eat the whole sacrifice, and if you don't have enough people in your bayit, you join up with the next bayit. It's eaten in the house. It's eaten in groups called the chabura, and it's actually a unique sacrifice. We have nothing like this, where actually the group has to declare themselves part of the group before they can bring the Korban Pesach. And you can't leave the group. The chabura, it's called in the Talmud. So the Korban Pesach then becomes the very sacrifice itself. It's a shared sacrifice. It's the beginnings of peoplehood. It's a step in that direction. The idea of the Korban Pesach being a shared experience is understood by our rabbinic tradition, which we have no Korban Pesach nowadays, but we still try to develop, encourage, embellish the idea of the house. It's actually very interesting, about something about the Seder that is very interesting. The Seder is by far and away the most popular Jewish ritual that we have. I mean, there are many kinds of Sedarim. There are very traditional Sedarim. There are always people who want to do new things, have different kinds of stuff. But many Jews, most Jews, participate in one form of Seder or another. So but when you think about the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice, there is something very remarkable about the Korban Pesach. And that is, when you look at the book of Exodus, the Korban Pesach is brought in the house and on the house. The blood of the sacrifice, all sacrifices, the blood is the key ingredient, but the blood is put on the door. That's when you read the book of Exodus. When you get to the fifth book of the Torah, Sefer Dvarim, then suddenly, remarkably, the Korban Pesach is described completely differently. No longer is the brought in the individual house. The Torah makes it clear in chapter 15, 16 of Deuteronomy that the Korban Pesach was brought inside the temple. Everybody goes up to the temple. It exactly completely contradicts what it says earlier in the Torah. Of course, the commentaries discuss this at great length, but my point is a simple point. Whereas it's true that what was initially an event which takes place in the Bayit, later in the book of Deuteronomy becomes something that takes place in the national institution of the temple. But when it comes to our Seder, there's the emphasis on the Bayit. The Seder is a home ritual. We have nothing like it, actually. And maybe that's one of the reasons that it's so popular. It's not in the synagogue. It's done in the house. And I was even thinking that there's an old custom that at one point in the Seder, we open up the door and invite people in, whether it's Elijah the prophets, or we invite. The idea that our house is open underscores that, yes, the Korban Pesach in the book of Deuteronomy is not in the house, but our practice, we're going back to the initial practice, as it were, and emphasizing the Bayit. So there is the sense of the Korban Pesach as a shared experience. Now, what did the rabbinic tradition do with this at our Seder? Well, the rabbinic tradition added as a central feature of the Seder the idea of telling the story. What the Haggadah calls in the beginning of the Haggadah, mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'tziat Mitzrayim. No matter how much you know, there's a mitzvah l'saper b'tziat Mitzrayim. So let's reflect for a moment on this mitzvah of l'saper b'tziat Mitzrayim, which is the introduction to the sipur and the second cup. The first cup was Kiddush. There's another mitzvah that we have, which the Haggadah references. Haggadah references another related mitzvah. In the Haggadah, it says that Ben Zoma and the Chachamim had a disagreement. According to Ben Zoma, he says he struggled his whole life to validate his position that one must mention the exodus from Egypt twice a day, even at the night. The rabbis disagreed. The rabbi said you only have to mention the exodus during once a day, in the day. And Ben Zoma says you mention it, right? You mention Elazar Azariah. I couldn't validate my position until Ben Zoma said, the verse says to remember the exodus all the days of your life. Kol yemei chayecha. Yemei chayecha hayomim, kol yemei chayecha halilot. You have to remember it in the morning and at night. The Chachamim said, no. Kol yemei chayecha is in the world today. Kol yemei chayecha, the kol is lavili mota Mashiach. So they disagree whether you have to mention the Exodus once a day or twice a day. That's what it says in the Haggadah. What does that mean? It doesn't mean the Seder is in the daytime. is talking about a different mitzvah. There's a separate mitzvah to remember the Exodus every single day. When we say the Shema, and we read the third paragraph of the Shema, I am the God who took you out of Egypt. We're mentioning, it's called Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim. So there's a disagreement. Is that twice a day or once a day? The Shema said twice a day. And Ben Zoma argued twice a day. So they're two different mitzvot. There's a mitzvah every single day of the year, twice a day, to remember the Exodus. And there's a mitzvah once a year, which is to tell the story. And the telling the story goes way beyond remembering. First of all, remembering, you can remember, you don't have to say anything. You can remember it, or maybe you have to say, I remember. But you don't need another party. But to tell the story, you need another party. So the mitzvah at the Seder is to tell the story. One of the reasons, in my opinion, that we say Holach Ma'anya, we invite in guests, is because we want people to hear the story. To hear the story means there's another party. And it means something else, actually, if you're really telling the story, because everybody's story is different. Nobody has the same story. If you see yourself as being in Egypt, and I see myself as being in Egypt, we're not going to have the same story, because we're coming from different places. Maybe you're someone who knows what it means to be in a foreign place and to leave your home and go elsewhere. Maybe I have a different experience. Everybody has a different story, but you require the other. You're going to share your story with the other. And that is what is central to the Haggadah, because the Haggadah understands that telling the story is not just remembering. Telling the story means, first of all, discussing with somebody else. Who is the somebody else? It might be a child. The Haggadah emphasizes very much the intergenerational learning. Manishtana is recited by a young person. And then, of course, in the Haggadah, Keneged Arba Banim Dibra Torah. Torah spoke, as it were, of 4 different kinds of children. So in other words, responding to the other person depends who the person is. And we have to try to figure out and work on the best way to communicate what we're trying to teach. And we don't have the same answer, because depending on the person, the story will always be different. So there's the learning that's intergenerational. There's the Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim with the children asking questions. If they don't ask, we have to tell the story. And then, of course, we have in the Haggadah, towards the very beginning, the story of the 5 sages who were sitting in Bnei Brak, and they were up the entire night until their pupils came and said to them, Rabbis, it's time to say the morning Shema. They were so engrossed in the learning and the study that they didn't even realize that the night had passed. That's a different kind of learning. That's the learning with peers. There's learning with peers, and there's learning with intergenerational, and there's teaching, and there's understanding, and there's hearing, all different kinds of learning. What they have in common, all of these stories, is that it's participatory. It's not just me, because if it's just remembering, I don't need anybody else. But if it's telling the story, I need somebody else. And now there's something else that is central to the rabbinic tradition, which is, and this is central to the Seder. Now we come to what is the core text of the Seder, which is rather remarkable. It's sometimes we take things for granted, but they're so strange. And when you stop for a moment and think about it, it's extremely strange. Many years ago, I wrote a commentary on the Haggadah. Actually, it was written by my student and colleague, Rachel First, many years ago already, 12, 13 years ago. The name of the Haggadah was Tzei Ulamad, go forth and learn. And that comes from the Haggadah. The Haggadah has in the middle of the telling of the story, right in the middle on that second cup of wine, Tzei Ulamad, go and study what Laban the Aramean tried to do to Jacob, our father. Tzei Ulamad, Mabikesh Lavan Ha'arami. And the Tzei Ulamad, to go forth and learn, is a recitation of 4 verses from the Torah. And on each verse, there is a kind of exegesis. There's a try to understand something. We ask a question. We want to understand something about these verses. Now, what is exceedingly strange here is that these 4 verses, which are the core verses of the Haggadah, we would all expect. It's the night of the Exodus. And at the night of the Exodus, we are commanded to tell the story of the Exodus. And we are going to choose verses from the Torah through which we will tell the story of the Exodus. One would expect, I think, logically, that the verses that we cite would be from the book of Exodus. But lo and behold, the 4 verses are not from the book of Exodus at all. They're from the book of Devarim, chapter 26. And not only that, what is even stranger is that the 4 verses that the Haggadah singles out as the key verses are verses that the pilgrim recites when they bring the first fruits to the temple. The first fruits to the temple is not associated with Passover. The holiday of first fruits is the holiday of Shavuot. It's called Yom HaBikurim. So we take a text that's appropriate for a different holiday, not in the book of Exodus. We are to read these 4 verses, and then the Mishnah said, V'doresh kol haparsha kula, and you must engage in drisha. We like the drisha. We like that idea of engaging in drisha. It means you study. It's not telling the story. Apparently, is not just telling the story. It's actually studying the story. In other words, the very fact that you have to tell the whole story based on 4 verses, you are required to exercise your imagination. And not that the tradition wanted us just to read the Haggadah. I don't think that's true. I think in many places, many people, we fall back on that. But the truth is that the obligation to study 4 verses is pushing us in a certain direction. It's asking us to raise all kinds of questions. Everybody has their own questions. We are to engage in midrash. It's the only time we have a commandment in our tradition to engage in midrash. So it's not about just talking to each other, which is important. It's about studying with the other. A community is a community that studies with each other. And that means that a community, I'm a member of, I'm studying with you, okay? Inevitably, we're going to disagree, or we're going to question, which is what study is all about. It's about, I hear what you say, I'll think about it, I have a different point of view. And let's go back to the text. Let's see which interpretation is a better reading of the text. Okay, and then what are the implications of the text? Oh, I see it this way. You may see it a different way. The idea of people that come together, not just to share a meal, which is important, not just to share a sacrificial meal, which is very important, because through the sacrificial meal, we are declaring ourselves as servants of God. That's what optimally the Jewish community is, each one in a different way. But we also come together to talk to each other, to learn from each other, and to engage in the attempt to try to figure things out together with the other. We may not even like the other, but we understand we're part of one community. We have to hear what they have to say. So that's the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's a mitzvah of study. And that's how the rabbinic tradition understands the night of Passover. And I would add one other detail here, which I think is very important about this mitzvah, which is unique. V'doresh kol haparsha kula, to engage in midrash at the Seder. What is the idea of midrash? Here we come to something to me that is very basic about the Seder, and something really to think about very deeply. What the idea of midrash is this: we have an ancient text. We have 4 verses from the Torah. Ancient, thousands of years old. The claim that midrash makes is that when we go back to the text and we look at the text and we find difficulties in the text, the claim the midrash makes is that we can still discover meaning in the text that speaks to me today. The midrash tries to bridge the gap between me, who I'm alive today, and the text that was written 3,000 years ago. The Midrash claims that when we go back to it, look at it, study it, we can all pull meaning out of the text that speaks to where we are. That's the idea of Midrash. And especially at the Seder, because this tension of where am I? I'm living here today. I don't necessarily prima facie buy into everything it says in the Torah. The Torah has certain ideas, certain way of description. Torah has slavery. Yes, it limits slavery, and we celebrate freedom, but it does permit slavery, and etc., etc. When you read the Chumash, but the Midrash claims that the Jewish people have an interpretive tradition, and these texts remain meaningful for us if we know how to interpret them, and that's the key. If we know how to interpret them, we can find meaning even in these ancient texts. So at the Seder, on one hand, we are saying we see ourselves as back in Egypt. We want to imagine ourselves as there. That's very important, the exercise of imagination. On the other hand, we're actually not there. We don't, yes, we suspend in a sense we suspend that disbelief. We try to put ourselves there. But I don't think that necessarily that means that at the very same time, we can't also recognize that in some sense, we are not there. I mean, being there means actually, among other things, that you don't know how it's going to end up. Haggadah wants us to pretend that we don't know how this is going to end up, to put ourselves in their place, to appreciate what those people did. The idea of following Moses and God into a desert. Yes, you're escaping Egypt. Not all of them wanted to escape Egypt, but the idea of following an idea, following a dream, it's not so simple. We know the end of the story. They didn't know the end of the story. That's what's so important about this. Try to imagine us there, to appreciate the people that came before us and the hardships that they faced. I'm not only talking about Mitzrayim. I'm talking about my own experience. I'm sure many people's experience as Jews in the United States of America, whose either parents or grandparents or great-grandparents came from faraway places with great difficulty, with great hardship to a foreign land, and they set stuff up for their children and their grandchildren, and we should never forget that. But part of the gratitude towards those who came before us, and gratitude is central to the Seder. I'll come to that in a minute, but my point is the second cup. The first cup is on time. The second cup is a community is shared experiences. And I think a Jewish community is sharing the experience of learning together, celebrating together, of studying together, of learning from each other. That is absolutely essential to the Seder, to the Haggadah. That's what the rabbinic, the Haggadah at the end of the day is a rabbinic construction. And you get a sense what was key to the rabbis. What's key to the rabbis is sitting down at the table with other people who are different and trying to respond to the other and trying to figure out at the same time how this speaks to ourselves. And that's the second cup. That's the second cup. Now I want to mention something about the third cup. The third cup is the cup that we drink at the end of the meal. At the end of the meal. The meal, what is the meal? It's a festive meal, but in particular, the Pesach meal is special. I mean, the old Pesach meal was the sacrifice. We don't have a sacrifice. Okay, with the Afikomen, we remember the sacrifice, which was eaten at the end of the meal, by the way. Well, we don't have an Afikomen, but for us, we don't have a Pesach. But for us, the meal consists, what we do have is matzah, the key symbol. We have matzah, and we have the bitter herbs. The matzah and the maror. We eat them separately, we combine them, we have korech, but that is the meal. That's the mitzvah. The first mitzvah is kiddush, the second mitzvah is sipu yetziat Mitzrayim, the third mitzvah is matzah and maror, and a remembrance of the Pesach. And what's interesting is that when you look at the Haggadah, and I'm hoping that this presentation will help people, at least encourage people to at your Seder, to think more about these issues and to look at the Haggadah more carefully and to try to see how the Haggadah is working through these issues. So one of the things we look for in any text is keywords or phrases that repeat. And at the Haggadah, there's a little verse that we say 4 different times, 4 times, little verse. You shall tell your child, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeitim mitzrayim. Ba'avur zeh, God did this for me when I left Egypt. Now, the truth of the matter is, when you look at the verse, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeitim mitzrayim, it's an incredibly difficult verse to translate. And there's an enormous amount of disagreement of what in the world, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeitim mitzrayim. What does that actually mean? So one of the interpretations, commentaries is the following. You're eating the matzah and the maror, and you tell the child, tell the one, it doesn't have to be a child, but the one who's asking the question, who doesn't know. Well, what's this all about? Ba'avur zeh. So the Ibn Ezra says it means the following, that we left Egypt in order, not in order to eat the matzah and the maror, but along those lines, in order to serve God. That this ritual that we perform, the ritual of the matzah and the ritual of the maror, is emblematic, says the Ibn Ezra, of the fact, why did God take us out? What was the goal of God taking us out of Egypt? So the Ibn Ezra would say, well, God says later what the goal is. You don't oppress your fellow Jew. These are my servants whom I took out of Egypt. That in Egypt you were Pharaoh's servants. You were Avdei Paro. And now you are my servants. So the performance of these rituals are a demonstration of the fact that we see ourselves as commanded beings, and the commander is not Pharaoh, but the commander is God. And being God's servants is very different than being Pharaoh's servants. For example, when you're Pharaoh's servants, you're a slave, and there's no Shabbat, and there's no vacation, and the work has no meaning. For Pharaoh, the work has no purpose. He doesn't care about what you do. He wants to persecute you. He takes away your straw. Produce the same number of bricks with no straw, and they can't. If he cared about the work, he would say, produce more bricks. He doesn't say that. Purposeless work with no purpose, work with no end, never stops. When you work for God in the book of Exodus, you build a tabernacle. It's Shabbat. And the work has a meaning. The work has a purpose. Molechet machshevet. So the matzah and the maror, this emerges from the commentary of the Ibn Ezra. This is why we left. We left. In other words, if we ask ourselves the question, definition of community. A community actually has common rituals. Now, different communities may have additional rituals and different practices and different customs, etc. But there are certain rituals that unite the entire community. And the key one actually is the matzah. Our Seder, the symbol of Passover for us, is no Paschal sacrifice. The symbol for us is the matzah. And even the Pesach, we remember the Korban Pesach with the Afrikomen, which is also matzah. It's all matzah. So we share this in common. And I want to say something else about the matzah. Then I want to stop and take comments or questions. I'm happy to hear them. What is the idea of the matzah? Why is the matzah the key symbol for us on Passover? Yes, it's a ritual. And the fact of the matter is that we are studying, right? We study the story. And towards the end of the study of the story, we say, Rabbi Gamliel said, whoever didn't say these 3 things, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, hasn't it fulfilled the commandment of telling the story? Because the point is, our study has to lead us someplace. It's not just study in a vacuum. We're trying to study to figure out what we should be doing. That's the idea of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. But why specifically the Matzah? And it strikes me that what the matzah represents for us and represents in the Torah is this. In the Torah, we do want to make an alliance within the Bible in general. Often when you want to make a treaty, an alliance with somebody, a covenant, you actually eat together. You eat together. One can even see sacrifice that way. We are sharing a meal with God, as it were. The Paschal sacrifice is a sacrifice that is eaten, right? It's a sacrifice where the eating becomes essential. You're sharing with your fellow person. But the matzah actually, if eating bread demonstrates a bond, a connection, a relationship, what does eating matzah represent? Answer, a half-baked relationship. That is to say, an incomplete relationship. We celebrate the leaving of Egypt, but we understand through the eating of the matzah, it's the beginning of a journey. The community has to understand that nothing is ever, you're always on a journey. You have to understand you're always on a journey. And Passover, the holiday of Passover, is the beginning of a journey. And you don't know where the journey is going to end up if you're in Egypt, but it's the beginning of a journey. You step in the right direction. It's not a lechem. It's not a full relationship. There's so much lies ahead of us. And that's part of being a community, in my opinion. A community has shared goals. A community aspires to something. We have a cup of Elijah on the table, which means we're not there yet. But we're going to try to work together to get there. So I just would conclude this little presentation by saying the cups of wine, the ordering of this thing we call Seder, which means an order, this ordered event. It's about sacred time. It's about seeing time as yours, an opportunity to do what you should be doing, not living on someone else's calendar. It's a shared experience. It's a shared experience of being God's servants. It's a shared experience of coming together to learn from each other, to study. There's shared ritual, and there's shared aspirations. And an understanding that we're not there yet, and to get there, we have to work together. We can't just work separately. We have to work together. That, to me, comes through the great ritual we call the Seder. I thank you all. It's been a privilege and honor. 25th, hard to believe, 25th Rapoport Family Lecture. We have a few minutes. Let me take any comments or questions. I'm happy to try to address them. Yes.
Rabbi, there's something that's unique to our family, which is wild. I was just looking at Sam when you said we have to have a goal when we study. We can't, I mean, we can just study, but goal is the thing we do together. And so at the very towards the beginning of our Seder, and we're sort of a hybrid. My mother was Syrian and Sam's family is Ashkenaz. So boy, oh boy, to combine the Syrian and the Ashkenaz, we have wonderful food. That's the only thing I will say. But at the very beginning of the Seder, we do something because the Syrian Seder is so experiential. We take the chavilah, we take the bundle, let's say the Afikoman bundle, and we do Misharotam, Sererot Besimlotam al Shechmam, Ubnei Israel Ukidbar Moshe. And everybody says in Syrian, where are you going? Where are you coming from? Minayin Bata. And then they ask, and we say, Mitzrayim, and then they say, La'an Atem Holchem, where are you going to? And they say, Yerushalayim, and then the entire table says, Be'ezrat Ha'el. And every single person at the Seder, we have a little crib sheet even, goes through this. And the bundle is not taken over the shoulder the easy way, which would be over the front of the body, to symbolize how God took us misaviv, he took us around. You have to carry the bundle over your shoulder and all around the other side. And so this is our shared goal. And I never, ever thought of it that way, Rabbi. I thought of it as part of the experience of the Seder, but never, as you put it, the study, the experience has
we experienced that one year. We were not home, we were away, and we ate at a family, a Syrian family actually, and they had that. But the truth is, even the Ashkenazim, we end with Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. That's how we end that Seder. So the fact is, we all realize we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And in the beginning of the Seder, Holach Ma'anya, L'Shana Haba B'nei Chorin, L'Shana Haba B'Eretz Yisrael. we have our aspirations. It's very important. And the cup of Elio says the same thing. We're not there yet. You know, I'm not sure we ever fully get there, but the idea of being on a journey and celebrating the Exodus. It's a very interesting, by the way, that you say this, because you would think about, in our tradition, you would celebrate conquering the land as being the central event. We celebrate being slaves in Egypt and getting out of slavery, which is remarkable, actually, when you think about it, because all the people that leave Egypt, they die in the desert. I mean, nonetheless, but they took the first step. So we are grateful to those people who took the first step, and we're trying to keep it going. We're trying to move it forward. But we never forget where we came from. That's something that's so important, I think. And I think the idea of looking at Jewish history and not forgetting where we came from and the various struggles, and we have an obligation to continue their good work in the past and to move it forward in the ways that we can, individually and as a community. I think that's what the Seder is really about at its core. So it's very powerful, and as you say, it may be a Syrian practice, but it's reflected in everyone's practice. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering if perhaps one could say that the rabbis took the model of the Korban Pesach also as a model for Chanukah, because the Gemara says that the mitzvah of Chanukah is ner ish ubeto.
Right. You're 100% right that the two holidays on our calendar that are family holidays are Hanukkah and Pesach. There's no question about that. I mean, Hanukkah is actually related to the holiday of Sukkot primarily, but your point is well taken. And especially given the fact that Hanukkah celebrates the rededication of the temple, which is the communal structure. It's very striking that with mitzvahs ner ishu beito, that we take that public menorah, which is the menorah of the Jewish people collectively, and we transport it to our homes. So I think those two holidays, Pesach and Hanukkah, are very popular holidays with the Jewish people, precisely because they are rooted in the home. And something to think about, I've spoken about this in the past, and talking about people's engagement with Judaism in general, I think the more we think about what things actually work, what is the Seder, which is number one, and Hanukkah, that would be very interesting in terms of thinking moving forward, how we can make Judaism, I wouldn't say easier for people. I'm not big on being comfortable or easy, but how we can get it to speak to them in a very different way by moving the practices more inside the home, and in addition to what we do communally in other kinds of spaces. But your point, I think, is important, the ner ishu beito, absolutely. And in Pesach, as I pointed out, even though the Chumash moves Pesach away from the house in Sefer Devarim, you bring the Paschal sacrifice in the temple, but our Seder, and you have, it's interesting study in general, how often the minhag, the custom of the people, takes us back to an earlier stage. So I think that's exactly what's happening with the Pesach. I'll take one more comment if anybody has a comment.
Feel free to unmute and ask or raise your hand.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Where's the community then? If, as it says in the Mishnah, even if you're only one person,
right,
you tell the story, what community, other than, of course, the imagined community, what community exists in that case?
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, let me say that is a case in the Mishnah which there's actually a dispute in the Talmud whether you can bring the Paschal sacrifice if you don't have other people. There's actually a dispute about that, which we have no other sacrifice. Because like I said, it's not a communal sacrifice. So, but you're right. The point is that you're right. But if there's nobody else, then what are the options? The options is not to have a Seder or to do a Seder. And one might say you tell yourself the story. That's what I think it is. But that is a situation where the Mishnah is saying, from a practical standpoint, we don't want people not to have a Seder. So therefore, but that's a kind of b'diavad. That's given that situation, then you tell yourself. You're talking to yourself, as it were. It's hard. It's easier when someone else asks the questions. When we ask questions to ourselves, you got to step out of yourself to ask the question to yourself. But I would say that is certainly what you say is right. But I would say that is not not the hoped for situation. That's a b'diavad. In such a case, this is what we have to do. It's certainly better than nothing, but it's certainly not the ideal that comes through the way this Seder has been structured. It's certainly about engaging with the other, telling the story. And as I said before, it's never the same story. If you're telling your story and your understanding of it, it will vary depending upon whom you're speaking to, because you want to talk to the other person. They have to understand you, and you have to know whom you're talking to. And also because every situation is different. We're never in the same situation ourselves. It's always a little bit different. So there's always should be variety. And even though we have a fixed text for the Haggadah, that's a jumping off point. That's not really what it's about. It's not about reading. It's a midrash. Midrash is always personal because it's where I am today in reference to the ancient text. I think I'll stop at this point, but yes, go ahead.
I would add, it also changes, it changes year to year, even if you, the person, is telling it, because you're in a different place each year.
Totally
and
right.
The world is in a different place. So the text looks different to you each year, the same text,
100%,
when you reflect on it.
We're not the same person either. And our situation is always different. And you just say the world is certainly different, sometimes at a pace we don't particularly appreciate, but the world changes very quickly. Okay, I wish all of us a meaningful Pesach, and hopefully this will be somewhat helpful in terms of our own Sedarim, and hope for a better future, and a better future for us all as individuals and as the Jewish community. And Chag Sameach.
Amen.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Silber.
Thank you.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Silber, for this incredible lecture. And thank you so much to the Rapoport family for facilitating us all learning together.
Thank you, Lily.
Just as we end, I want to thank all of you for learning with us and let you know that the learning doesn't end here. The Svira Zman at Drisha is coming up, but if you want to keep learning with Drisha even before that, our Mishnah in Depth series continues with Nazir and Sota with Rav Avi Wolfish. I just put a link that goes to our incredible new website where you can sign up to continue learning in our Mishnah in Depth series on Sundays. I hope to see you all again at Drisha programs very soon.
And the diary test is today 1:30. Today it usually starts at 1. Today it starts at 1:30. With Avi Wolfish. Avi Wolfish is the world's expert on Mishnah, by the way. He's the expert in the world on Mishnah. So it's if you can study with him, it's a great privilege to do so. Okay, thank you all again. And Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.